podcast. I'm Miri Stickland, Knowledge Development Lawyer in the Commercial Real Estate team. Continuing on the logistics theme from our previous podcast, I'm delighted to be joined today by Jeff Wilson, Director at Wrenbridge, one of the UK's leading property development and investment companies with particular expertise in the sector. And alongside Jeff is commercial real estate partner Vicki Towers, who's worked with Wrenbridge on a long-standing basis. And as Vicki reminded me earlier this week, she's celebrating 14 years at Forsters. Thanks for joining me. So I thought it would be appropriate to kick off by asking you to give a sort of brief history of Wrenbridge, Jeff, and then maybe talk about the sort of enduring relationship with Forsters.
Yeah, sure. So Wrenbridge was founded in 1993 by Peter Jarman, Tim Holmes, and they came together with Ray Palmer at the time. I think the story goes that Peter and Tim put an advert in the EG as a new property company looking for funding. And I think Ray had recently sold his share of Lambert Smith Hampton, and they came together. Wrenbridge was formed, and Palmer Capital was formed, and really, I guess they just sort of started small funded developments on a case-by-case basis, and then after, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so of Wrenbridge, the first larger funds were raised by Palmer Capital, which gave Wrenbridge a bit more firepower to do not necessarily bigger deals, but probably more deals and perhaps more speculative deals rather than occupier-led deals. I joined in 2007, so 13 years this summer. And I think Ben joined in about 2004, and Ben is the chief executive. So there's a long history of people being at Wrenbridge for a long time, probably similar to Forsters actually. And yeah, I think Wrenbridge and Forsters have worked together for
over 20 years. It must be,
yeah,
I think, because it predates me joining. Eugene used to do some work for them, and Smita Edwards is client partner, of course, and has worked with Ben for a long time. And then, as you mentioned, Miri, I joined in 2006 and then started working with Jeff in 2007. And then he hasn't been able to really get rid of me since then, to be honest. So,
is it Stockholm syndrome, Jeff?
I think so. I was thinking ahead of this podcast that some of the first deals we worked on together, and I guess we both joined respectively sort of just before the financial crisis, and then worked on deals coming out of the financial crisis. And we had some pretty interesting early deals to work on when everything was quite difficult for a few years. It was a real baptism of fire for both of us, I think.
It really was. I've got a couple that spring to mind, and you doing your site visits and coming back having had some various encounters with people on site, and us trying to work through exactly how we were going to do the deals and all the ins and outs. It was good
fun,
stuff.
good learning experience as well.
So, Jeff, can you give us a sort of overview of what the business model is that Wrenbridge operate on, why you operate on that basis, and why you think it's successful?
Yeah, I guess there's not really a sort of set business model, but what we try to do is, we always work by the mantra of work hard, have fun, and don't let people down. And whilst that's not necessarily a business model, it is the way we approach our business. And I think it's the reason why people stay at Wrenbridge for a long time, and it's probably the reason why we have so much repeat business with people. So with other companies, we've just talked about how long we've worked with Forsters, and we've got similar relationships with architects we've worked with for years, engineers, all of the key practices that help us do what we do. And I think the other thing that we quite often talk about is doing the right thing, rather than doing necessarily the most commercial thing. And again, that is a sort of key part of our business model. And from a sort of commercial business perspective, a lot of what we do is spec development to trade. And in some ways, that's the sort of more boring detail of our business model. But actually, the model is try to be normal and try to be sort of quite fun to work with, and then hope that you build relationships with people that just endure.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, from my perspective, working with you, obviously, I see those relationships, not only our own, but the ones you have with consultants, contractors, and the rest of the team. And the word that sort of sprang to mind when I was sort of reflecting on this was how collaborative you are with all of that, and also with those that you JV with and the team as a whole. And also in terms of occupier demands, investor demands, you're just always looking to improve and work with everyone in a really collaborative way. And I think that really comes through, and how successful you are is an indictment of that.
That kind of leads us on quite nicely to how you think the business has evolved over your time at Wrenbridge, and I guess also, you know, doing a bit of future gazing, how you think it's going to further evolve.
Yeah. So I guess taking first how the business has evolved. I mean, one of the key things that we did in sort of 2009, I think, was to look much harder at doing more in the southeast and in London. So Wrenbridge was, I probably should have said earlier, but Wrenbridge was established in Cambridge and was probably well known to begin with for doing deals in Cambridge and in East Anglia. And we looked quite hard coming out of 2008, 2009 at doing more in the southeast and more in London. And that's something that I've really pushed hard to do over the last 10 years. And I think that's been an effective way to evolve. And through that same period, we've done more and more warehouse development. So we are a multi-sector developer, and we shouldn't forget that. But we always think quite carefully about how the real estate world is evolving. And it was clear that warehouse occupation and warehouse development would become more and more important. So we have evolved with that, and certainly a larger proportion of what we do now is warehouse development.
Yeah, I think that's exactly as you say, because I mean, we mentioned some of the old deals we did way back, and they weren't logistics focused or industrial. You know, they had retail, didn't they? Office, bit of resi, bit of everything. So the way you've adapted and sort of focused on logistics for now and warehousing is, you know, evident and reflective of the market, isn't it, really, and where it's going?
Yeah, and I think probably one of the first spec warehouse deals we worked on together, Vicki, was Circular Point in Chingford.
Yes.
That was a really good start to our London warehouse development, and in some ways became a bit of a model for us, where we bought a 4-acre site funded by what was called the Palmer Capital Development Fund at the time. We spec built 3 warehouse units and 7 trade units. We pre-let a couple, and we ended up forward selling that to BlackRock at the time.
Yeah.
And that became a really good benchmark to work to. And we've worked on quite a few since with similarities to that.
And I think you've also, haven't you, sort of built on sort of an area, if you like. So there's one site, you know, you'd find a site, and then around the locality find other sites, and then you can roll out that model, which, you know, is a success, or has been to date. And that's, you know, that's proven successful as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, there's a few good examples actually down in Belvedere where it comes back to our sort of business model of doing the right thing and relationships, where we've managed to do multiple deals in the same area because we've got to know our neighbours effectively. And the first one we did was a scheme we ended up calling Graviton. And I remember our first site visit with you, Vicki, and you were wearing the most inappropriate shoes I've ever done on a site visit.
So I remember the fund manager at Palmer looking at me just saying, "What on earth are you doing?" And you were laughing your head off in the background. Hadn't fully appreciated what the site was going to look like, Jeff, in fairness. Needless to say, wasn't there a horse roaming around when we got there, just to give an idea of the type of site. Anyway, yeah. Thanks for reminding me of that one.
Pleasure.
Lesson learnt though. Hey, I bet you've now got a set of sort of pink studded Diamante Hunter Wellies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're silver, but yeah, same.
So, Jeff, what's going to be high on the agenda of the sort of logistics occupiers of the future, do you think?
Yeah, it's something we constantly challenge ourselves to make sure we understand our occupiers, future occupiers. And I sort of touched on part of our business model is spec development in the southeast. And there's an interesting sort of contrast between spec development, where we're constantly seeking to give our future occupier the most flexibility we possibly can, because we don't know who they're going to be, versus the sort of the technology that we know that the modern logistics occupier needs. So there's two strands really. There's the spec development, where you want to make sure you're building highly sustainable, highly flexible warehouse space. And I think sustainability is probably the most important evolutionary aspect of our specification. I've been on a call just this morning, actually going through all of the sustainability items on a scheme we're hoping to start on quite soon, which we went to planning committee on recently. So future proofing in that regard is hugely important. And then separately, if you're working with an occupier from the start, there's absolutely far more technology involved, because you're dealing with their fit out and their specific occupation day one. So there is a big contrast actually between the two for us.
Yeah, and I suppose, Jeff, just going back to your point where it's on the spec side, you want to ensure, don't you, for any tenant, that the costs in terms of maintenance, energy, all that, are as low as possible for the occupier, because that's what they're seeing more and more. It's no longer the add-on; it's integral, isn't it, to the end product? Yeah,
completely. Yeah, and it's really interesting just how important it is to the end investor as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And in some ways, from a spec development point of view, the end investor is driving the sustainability agenda even harder than the occupier, and we need to be ahead of that. So if we're planning on a scheme that, say we're going in for planning on something, we've got to go through the determination period, go out to tender, then build it. We need to ensure that we're very alive to what's going to be required in 12 to 18 months time as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the green funds that are coming in, where a certain level of sustainability and well-being as well has to be achieved, which we're seeing more and more. It's interesting, and it'll be fantastic when we sort of see it coming through in the developments.
Yeah, just sort of a couple of examples, and we are sort of BREEAM Excellent as standard on our warehouse schemes now, and then within BREEAM Excellent there are areas where, rather than BREEAM being a sort of box ticking, point acquiring exercise, we're trying to make sure that we understand what's actually useful as well within that. So electric vehicle charging points is one sort of item of detail that, rather than just hitting what you need to hit to get your BREEAM points and to satisfy the planners, we're trying to make sure that we're future proofing to enable an occupier with 100% electric vehicle fleet to be able to come in and not have to sort of retrofit or dig up the yard, for example. So little things like that are really high on our agenda at the moment. Yeah, picking up on Vicki's well-being point, that's another area that we spend a lot of time working on and thinking about. You naturally want your scheme to be as efficient in the use of land as it can be, but we know that our end occupiers, certainly in areas where there's a big competition for labour, the staff well-being is so high on their agenda. I've heard examples in Milton Keynes where, because John Lewis have got quite a high warehouse presence there, and their staff well-being attention to detail is so high, it's actually sort of driven the market to do better. So we now look at trying to find spaces within our schemes where we can put in a outside space, green space, that doesn't interfere with yards and parking. So we've got a scheme that Forsters work on with us in Bedford called Fuse Wixham's. We've effectively got a park within the scheme where anyone who works there, it's sort of common parts rather than demised to anyone in particular, and you could just go and sort of hang out there at lunchtime. And we're trying to make sure that our schemes have the ability for staff to either eat outside, congregate outside, interact with any local parkland or lakeland. So we've got a new scheme in Dartford, and really important part of the design is working out how the sort of local footpaths connect in, and actually one of them comes through our scheme, and we've designed it so that it doesn't interfere with yards and parking, so it's completely safe for people to basically walk through our scheme. So yeah, it's a really good point, and another one that's becoming more and more important.
what sort of measures can you take internally to assist on that wellbeing front?
So the obvious one for us is natural light in the warehouse. So we tend to specify quite high levels of roof lights within the warehouse, and we quite often get comments on our schemes when they're finished, when we take occupiers around, just how much natural light there is in there. So the warehouse space is an important area to do it. The office space, we try to ensure that it's designed in a way that it's got as much access to outside light as possible. So the floor plates aren't too deep. So it's the same disciplines that you'd expect if you were designing an office building, but not sort of put in the back of your mind because it's a warehouse. So the office will feel like a really light, airy office with high ceilings. And sometimes you're trying to sort of challenge the team to make sure we're not spending too much on a development, and a suggestion from a QS might be, well, is your floor to ceiling height too high? And we tend to say no, that's the way it's got to be. So I think the areas where your occupier is naturally going to spend the greatest amount of their time, they just need that attention to detail.
So just to finish up, Jeff, can I just ask you, and I'm sure these are all going to involve Vicki, some of your personal highlights since you joined Wrenbridge, as you mentioned, in 2007?
Yeah, some do involve Vicki, actually. I hadn't thought before this of the shoes in Belvedere, but that's probably in the top 10. I think, there's deal highlights, and I guess, when you do what we do, you actually enjoy the thrill of buying something, the thrill of developing something, and then and letting it and selling it. And we've done some great things together with Forsters. The ones that spring to mind, and probably maybe the most recent one, was we built out a scheme in Dartford, funded by Buccleuch, who are another really valuable partner to us, and Forsters and Wrenbridge do lots of repeat work with Buccleuch, and we bought a site close to the Dartford Bridge, which we spec built and ended up letting during construction to Network Rail and selling to an institution to ASI. And I think everyone at the end of that process felt like they'd very happily do it all again with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. It did have its trials, didn't it, Jeff? But but that's what made it. And like you say, on reflection, it's those sorts of things that get you through it and mean you'd be more than, well, it'd be excellent to do something like that again.
So I think that type of situation where you kind of come out of the process and you've got to know the people you've worked with, you've kind of built up a bit of a friendship with them through the process, and you've been through something quite challenging at times, but only because you all want to get through it, and if you all sort of like each other at the end, so much the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that won Deal of the Year, didn't it, Jeff, at the Industrial Agent Society?
Thanks for raising that. Yeah. It did win an award. Yeah. I was thinking the other day of, do you remember we bought and sold a few freehold sites in Oxford, where we had identified Oxford as a location where we probably almost try and operate in any sector, because it's such a strong city, parallels with Cambridge, which we understand really well. And so we ended up buying an office building in the middle of Oxford that we ended up selling to Premier Inn, and we bought a car dealership on the way into Oxford, which we ended up selling to one of the Oxford colleges. And I look back on those processes with real fondness, because you meet such interesting characters operating in a city like Oxford or Cambridge, quite challenging characters and intellectual people that expect you to really understand what you're doing. So both of those were really enjoyable processes, and Forsters were, I'm not just saying this for your benefit, but Forsters were absolutely excellent, both of those.
Thanks both so much for joining me today. It's been really interesting and a lot of fun as well. If listeners would like to hear any of our other podcasts, you can check them out on SoundCloud, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you want to know more about Wrenbridge, their website is wrenbridge.co.uk. If you'd like more news and views from Forsters, head over to forsters.co.uk, and we're also on the usual social media channels, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. And until next time, goodbye.
Forsters More Than Law podcast is for general information only and should not be considered to be professional advice. Forsters LLP accepts no liability or responsibility for any direct or consequential loss arising from the use of, reliance on or reference to this podcast. Forsters LLP makes no warranty or representation as to the accuracy of the information contained in this podcast. The More Than Law podcast and all copyright in it is the property of Forsters LLP, and it should not be used, reproduced or quoted, whether in whole or part, without Forsters LLP's prior written consent.